In August 1947, one man's impatience to get home to London set in motion a single rushed decision that left up to 2 million men, women, and children dead. He never faced a court. He never lost a title. He went to his grave celebrated as a war hero, a statesman, and the beloved mentor of a future king. Most people know Lord Mountbatten as the dashing royal legend tragically murdered by the IRA. But the real story is far darker and far more damning. Because behind the medals and the movie star smile was a man whose vanity carried a body count. Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas of Battenberg was born on June 25, 1900, at Frogmore House in Windsor, practically in the shadow of the castle itself. His great-grandmother was Queen Victoria. His relatives sat on half the thrones of Europe. By the accident of birth, the boy known as Dickie was handed a golden ticket most people couldn't dream of. Then, in 1914, the golden ticket caught fire. When the First World War broke out, Britain turned violently against anything German, and the Battenbergs were about as German as a royal family could get. Dickie's father, Prince Louis, was First Sea Lord, the professional head of the entire Royal Navy. It didn't matter. The press hounded him, the public jeered him, and in October 1914 he was forced to resign in disgrace. 3 years later, the family scrubbed the German from their name entirely, trading Battenberg for the freshly invented Mountbatten. 14-year-old Dickie watched his father's career die of humiliation, and something in him seems to have snapped into place that day. By many accounts, he swore he would one day hold his father's job, First Sea Lord, and restore the family name. It sounds like the origin story of a hero. In reality, it forged something more dangerous, a man so obsessed with his own advancement, his own image, and his own timetable, that he would learn to treat everything else, including human lives, as negotiable. That obsession would eventually kill people by the million. But first, it made him rich. On July 18, 1922, the 22-year-old Mountbatten married Edwina Ashley at St. Margaret's, Westminster, with the Prince of Wales as best man. Edwina wasn't just beautiful and sharp. She was one of the wealthiest heiresses in Britain. Overnight, a minor royal with a naval salary became one half of the most glamorous couple in the empire. The fairy tale marriage lasted roughly as long as the honeymoon. Both of them took lovers, openly, constantly, and with a shamelessness that scandalized even the aristocracy, which took some doing. Mountbatten himself later summed it up with startling honesty, writing that, "Edwina and I spent all our married lives getting into other people's beds." That is a direct quote from the man himself. And frankly, that is too much information from a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. The rumors didn't stop at Edwina's affairs either. Whispers about Mountbatten's own private appetites followed him for decades. And years later, those whispers would land in the files of American intelligence in language so blunt it still stings. But that reckoning was still to come. Through the 1920s and 30s, Mountbatten climbed the Navy the way he did everything, with charm, connections, and a genius for publicity. He befriended film stars, courted the press, and polished his image like a trophy. When war came in 1939, he finally got his chance at glory, and very nearly sank it. Commanding the destroyer HMS Kelly, Mountbatten managed to get his ship torpedoed, mined, and ultimately sunk by German dive bombers off Crete in 1941, with the loss of more than half the crew. A more careful officer might have been quietly shelved. Instead, his friend Noel Coward turned the disaster into a heroic propaganda film, and Winston Churchill, who adored royal glamour, promoted him. Upward, spectacularly upward. In 1941, Mountbatten was made Chief of Combined Operations, planning raids on occupied Europe, leapfrogging men with decades more experience. Which brings the story to a small French port town called Dieppe, and one of the most needless slaughters of the entire war. On August 19, 1942, roughly 6,000 Allied troops, the overwhelming majority of them Canadian, stormed the beaches of Dieppe in broad daylight against a fortified coastline, with inadequate fire support and intelligence so poor it bordered on fantasy. The Germans were waiting. What followed wasn't a battle so much as an execution. Of the 6,086 men who made it ashore, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate approaching 60%, in the space of a single morning. Bodies of young Canadians carpeted the shingle beach. The operation achieved essentially none of its objectives. Mountbatten's fingerprints were all over it. Historians, most forensically Brian Loring Villa, in a landmark study of the raid, have laid out convincing evidence that the operation was remounted without proper authorization from the Chiefs of Staff, pushed forward by a combined operations command hungry for a headline. And when the corpses were counted, Mountbatten performed the maneuver he executed better than any amphibious landing. He dodged. For the rest of his life, he insisted Dieppe had been a priceless lesson that saved lives on D-Day, a claim many historians have picked apart as self-serving spin and worked tirelessly to massage the official record and shift blame onto others. Thousands of Canadian families buried their sons. The man who sent them got promoted again. And this, it turns out, was merely the rehearsal for what his ambition would do when handed an entire subcontinent. In 1943, Churchill made the 43-year-old Mountbatten Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. A stunning appointment for a man whose largest previous command had ended on the seabed near Crete. To be fair, the war in Burma was eventually won on his watch, though the grinding jungle victories belonged largely to General William Slim and his men. Mountbatten's genuine contribution was morale, diplomacy, and, naturally, publicity. He maintained an enormous personal staff and cultivated his image with the discipline other commanders reserved for logistics. He ended the war looking magnificent, which was, for him, always the point. Then, in February 1947, came the appointment that would define him and doom millions. Britain, bankrupt and exhausted, wanted out of India. Prime Minister Clement Attlee named Mountbatten the last Viceroy, with a mandate to hand over power by June 1948. 16 months to untangle 3 centuries of empire, in a land of 400 million people already crackling with religious violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. 16 months was dangerously little, so Mountbatten, in his infinite wisdom, decided to do it in 5. On June 3, 1947, he stunned the world by announcing that independence and the partition of British India into 2 nations, India and Pakistan, would happen on August 15, 1947, just 10 weeks away. Why the insane acceleration? Officially, to force the squabbling parties to act. But biographers have long argued the truer engine was Mountbatten himself. His restlessness, his eagerness to get back to his beloved naval career and his march toward First Sea Lord, and his instinct to move fast and look decisive, whatever the cost. The man who had rushed Dieppe was now rushing the fates of 400 million people. What that rush unleashed on the ground was a catastrophe so vast that its true scale deserves to be told in full. And it will be. But at the time, sitting in the Viceroy's palace in Delhi, Mountbatten was preoccupied with something closer to home. His wife had fallen in love with the future leader of India, Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru, the charismatic Prime Minister of the newborn nation, formed a bond in 1947 that was intense, romantic, and carried on essentially in public. Their letters, which survive, leave no doubt about the depth of their love, though whether the affair was ever physical is still debated by historians. What isn't debated is Mountbatten's reaction. He tolerated it. He facilitated it. According to multiple accounts, he would sometimes literally leave the room so his wife and the Prime Minister could be alone. Some biographers suggest he even found the arrangement politically useful. A private channel to the most powerful man in India. Take the most cynical courtier in 1,000 years of British history, and he would still tip his hat to that. Mountbatten stayed on as independent India's first Governor-General until 1948, waving from balconies while the country he'd carved up buried its dead. Then he sailed home to resume the only project he'd ever truly believed in, himself. And the project succeeded. In 1955, Louis Mountbatten was appointed First Sea Lord, the exact post his father had been hounded out of 41 years earlier. The boy who watched his father's humiliation had made good on his vow. And by 1959, he'd climbed even higher, to Chief of the Defence Staff, the top of Britain's entire military. It was, on paper, one of the great redemption arcs of the century. But the gilded image was already cracking in places the public couldn't see. Because in 1944, at the height of the war, the FBI had opened a file on him. American intelligence, wary of the flamboyant British commander, gathered reports describing Lord and Lady Mountbatten as persons of extremely low morals, and the file went further, referencing his rumored homosexuality and what it called other perversions. Those files, declassified decades later, must be handled with care. The FBI of that era hoovered up gossip as eagerly as fact. But the picture they paint of a public paragon privately regarded by an Allied intelligence service as a moral hazard was a bomb ticking quietly under his legacy for 75 years. And the files were not the last time Mountbatten's judgment flirted with the unthinkable. In 1968, with Britain in economic freefall, press baron Cecil King approached him with a proposal that sounded like fiction. A coup against Prime Minister Harold Wilson's elected government, with Mountbatten installed at the head of an emergency administration. The meeting genuinely happened. It's documented by men who were in the room. Accounts differ on how tempted he was. In most versions, he walked away once it was made clear the scheme was treason. But the fact remains that when someone proposed overthrowing British democracy, the offer was made to Uncle Dickie, and he took the meeting. Uncle Dickie. That was what the royal family called him in his final act, as he settled into the role of elder statesman and self-appointed puppet master of the House of Windsor. His favourite project was his great-nephew, Prince Charles. Mountbatten mentored the lonely young heir, wrote him letters, shaped his thinking, and gave him romantic advice that reads, in hindsight, like a curse. He counselled Charles to sow his wild oats and enjoy his affairs, but to eventually choose a sweet, inexperienced young girl as a bride. He even schemed to steer Charles toward his own granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, keeping the dynasty conveniently in the family. She turned Charles down, reportedly having seen exactly what marrying into that circus involved. Many royal historians have traced a straight, heartbreaking line from Mountbatten's worldview to the doomed marriage of Charles and Diana. The old man never lived to see that wreckage. His own ending came first, and it was horrific. Every August, Mountbatten holidayed at Classiebawn Castle, his summer home at Mullaghmore, on the northwest coast of Ireland, just miles from the border with Northern Ireland, then in the blood-soaked depths of the Troubles. Security officials warned him year after year that he was a target. He waved it off. He was 79, beloved, and, he apparently reasoned, what would anyone want with an old man pottering around in a boat? The IRA had an answer. On the night before August 27, 1979, a bomb maker named Thomas McMahon slipped aboard Mountbatten's unguarded wooden fishing boat, Shadow V, and planted roughly 50 pounds of gelignite. The next morning, Mountbatten set out to check his lobster pots with 6 others aboard, including 2 14-year-old boys, his grandson Nicholas and Nicholas's twin, Timothy, and a local teenager, Paul Maxwell, working as boat boy. Just after 11:30 a.m., a radio signal from the shore detonated the charge. The blast tore the boat to matchwood. Mountbatten was hurled into the water, his legs nearly severed. Fishermen pulled him out alive, but he died within moments. Nicholas, 14, was killed. Paul Maxwell, 15, was killed. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83, died of her injuries the next day. That same afternoon, the IRA killed 18 British soldiers in an ambush at Warren Point. the deadliest day the British Army suffered in the entire conflict. McMahon was convicted of the murders. He never expressed remorse for the children. Britain wept. The funeral filled Westminster Abbey. Prince Charles was shattered, mourning the man he called his honorary grandfather, and the legend was sealed in that moment. The great war hero, the Statesman of India, the kindly royal uncle, martyred by terrorists on a family holiday. That is the Mountbatten the world chose to remember, which makes this the moment to go back to August 1947, and the catastrophe that 10-week deadline actually unleashed. Because the full story of what Mountbatten's impatience did to India was never allowed to touch the legend. And it is the story that should define him. When Mountbatten slashed the timetable, the borders of the two new nations did not yet exist. To draw them, London sent out Cyril Radcliffe, a brilliant lawyer who had never been east of Paris and had never set foot in India in his life. Radcliffe was handed out-of-date maps, inconsistent census figures, and a task that should have taken years. Splitting Punjab and Bengal, provinces where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs lived village by village, house by house, intertwined for centuries. He was given roughly 5 weeks, 36 days to decide the fate of 400 million people, drawn by a man who, by his own admission, barely understood what he was cutting through. Then came a decision of almost surreal cynicism. The border lines were ready around August 9, yet the award was deliberately held back until August 17, 2 days after independence. The commonly accepted reading among historians is brutally simple.
In March
This
1947,
ensured the
Louis
celebrations,
Mountbatten
the
and his wife
flags,
Edwina
and the
arrived in New
photographs
Delhi.
of the smiling last
The
Viceroy
great-grandson
came
of Queen
first,
Victoria
and
and
the
second
chaos
cousin to George
landed
VI,
after Britain had
Mountbatten
formally
brings a
handed
regal
over
presence to the drama
responsibility.
of India's.
Millions of people woke up as free citizens without knowing which country their own village was in. When the line was finally published, the subcontinent tore itself apart. Between 10 and 15 million people fled their homes in both directions, the largest mass migration in human history, as neighbors turned on neighbors. Trains crossed the new border in silence, every passenger dead. Columns of refugees were ambushed and hacked apart on the roads. Wells were filled with bodies. And when the slaughter finally burned itself out, the most credible estimates put the dead at 1 to 2 million human beings, with countless women abducted and brutalized along the way. Radcliffe was so horrified by what his line had done that he refused his fee, burned his papers, and left India before the award was even announced, never to return. Mountbatten went home to his promotions, his medals, and his legend. He spent his remaining decades doing for India what he had done for Dieppe, polishing the story, deflecting the blame, insisting the bloodbath had been inevitable. And the polishing continued long after his death. His private diaries and letters were locked away at the University of Southampton, and the British government fought for years to keep them sealed. It took biographer Andrew Loney a legal battle lasting from 2019 to 2021, costing him over £400,000 of his own money. to force much of the archive open. What emerged confirmed the scale of the double life: the open marriage, the lovers, and a crown machine that had spent decades sanitizing Uncle Dickie for public consumption. There is one final irony, and it's the darkest line in the whole story. Louis Mountbatten drew a casual line on a map of someone else's homeland, and up to 2 million people died in the sectarian carnage that followed. Carnage he never had to witness, never answered for, and never truly acknowledged. 32 years later, on the coast of a divided Ireland, another sectarian conflict over another contested line reached out and blew him apart in his own boat. The man whose haste turned borders into graveyards was, in the end, killed by a border. History rarely writes justice so neatly, and it still wasn't justice for the 2 million, who never got a funeral at Westminster Abbey. Thanks for watching channel. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.